You don't understand. I work at St. Mark's. I was just getting off my shift. Look, here, this is my badge, see? Registered nurse. I help people. You can't just... I was born here!
Badge doesn't change anything.
Jesus
Y'all hear
Christ.
yourselves? No, keep walking, sir. Let's...
The alarm on Monica Turner's nightstand began its gentle chime at exactly 5:15 in the morning on that Thursday in late March. The sky outside her small apartment window was still draped in the deep purple of pre-dawn darkness, and for a moment she lay there beneath her covers, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood slowly coming to life. A dog barking somewhere down the block, the distant rumble of an early delivery truck, the soft hum of the refrigerator in her kitchen. These were the sounds of an ordinary morning, the kind of morning that promised nothing more than the routine she had built over the past few years of her life. She had no way of knowing that within the next 2 hours, everything she understood about safety, dignity, and her place in her own country would be shattered. Monica pushed back the covers and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor was cool beneath her feet as she made her way to the bathroom. She moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Shower, skincare, hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She brushed her teeth while mentally reviewing the patients she would be seeing that day. There was the 6-year-old boy recovering from appendix surgery who always asked her to draw smiley faces on his bandages. There was the teenage girl with the broken leg who was frustrated because she couldn't play soccer for 2 more months. There was the toddler with the respiratory infection whose mother barely spoke English and always looked so frightened when Monica entered the room. These were the people waiting for her, the people who depended on her gentle hands and calm voice to get them through some of the most difficult moments of their young lives. She walked to her closet and pulled out her teal scrubs, the ones she always wore on Thursdays because they had deeper pockets and she liked having extra space for the small notepads she used to jot down patient observations. She clipped her hospital identification badge to the front of her scrub top, positioning it carefully so that her photograph and credentials were clearly visible. The badge read, Monica Turner, RN, Pediatric Unit, Riverside Community Medical Center. Below her name was a barcode and an employee identification number. This badge represented nearly 3 years of hard work at this hospital, built upon 4 years of nursing school, built upon a lifetime of being an American citizen born and raised in the state of Arizona. Monica was 26 years old. She had been born in Tucson, in a hospital not so different from the one where she now worked. Her parents had been born in Arizona too. Her mother in Phoenix, and her father in a small town near the border that most people had never heard of. Her grandparents on her mother's side had come from New Mexico. Her grandparents on her father's side had roots in Texas going back 4 generations. The Turner family had been Americans for longer than many of the founding families of the communities where they lived. Monica had a birth certificate documenting her arrival into this world on American soil. She had a Social Security card that had been issued to her when she was just 2 weeks old. She had a driver's license with her photograph and address clearly printed on the front. She had a passport that she had used exactly twice, once for a nursing conference in Canada and once for a vacation to Mexico with her college roommates. Every piece of documentation that could possibly prove her citizenship was in her possession, organized neatly in a folder in her filing cabinet, ready to be produced at a moment's notice should anyone ever need to verify who she was. None of that documentation would matter in the slightest during the next few hours. Monica finished getting dressed and walked into her small kitchen. She poured herself a glass of orange juice and ate a banana standing at the counter, checking her phone for any messages from the hospital. There were none. She grabbed her keys, her purse, and her insulated lunch bag containing the salad she had prepared the night before. She paused at the front door, as she always did, to take one final look around her apartment. Everything was in its place. The pillows on the couch were arranged just so. The single dish she had used for breakfast was rinsing in the sink. Her bedroom door was closed. It was a small apartment, but it was hers, and she had worked hard to afford it on her nursing salary. She stepped outside into the cool morning air. The The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern horizon with streaks of orange and pink, and the temperature was pleasant enough that she didn't need a jacket over her scrubs. She walked to her car, a silver Honda sedan that she had purchased used 3 years earlier, right after landing her job at Riverside Community. The car had been reliable and practical, everything she needed for her daily commute and occasional trips to visit her parents on the other side of the city. She unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 6:32 a.m. Her shift started at 7, and the drive usually took about 18 minutes if traffic cooperated. She would arrive with time to spare, as she always did. Monica pulled out of her apartment complex parking lot and turned onto the main road that would take her toward the highway. The streets were relatively quiet at this hour, populated mainly by other early commuters and a few joggers taking advantage of the cool morning. She turned on the radio, letting the soft sounds of a morning news program fill the car. The anchors were discussing something about weather patterns and an upcoming local festival. Monica only half listened, her mind already focused on the day ahead. She thought about the medication schedules she would need to review, the parents she would need to reassure, the small moments of connection that made her job meaningful even when it was exhausting. She merged onto Route 58, a 4-lane highway that cut through the eastern part of the city. This stretch of road was lined with desert vegetation on both sides, saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels against the brightening sky. Traffic was light, just a handful of other vehicles spread out along the asphalt. Monica settled into the right lane, set her cruise control to exactly the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour, and relaxed into her seat. She had driven this route so many times that she could practically do it with her eyes closed. Every curve, every exit, every mile marker was familiar to her. That's when she noticed the dark SUV in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. There were always other vehicles on the highway, and an SUV behind her was hardly unusual, but something about this particular vehicle made her pay attention. It was maintaining a precise distance behind her, never falling back, never pulling closer. It stayed in the same lane she was in, matching her speed exactly. Monica found herself glancing at her rear-view mirror more frequently, trying to get a better look at the vehicle. The windows were tinted too dark for her to see the occupants. There were no markings on the exterior that she could make out from this distance. She told herself she was being paranoid. It was probably just another commuter heading in the same direction she was. Coincidences happened all the time. She forced herself to look away from the mirror and focus on the road ahead. The exit for Riverside Community Medical Center was coming up in about 4 miles. She would be at work soon, surrounded by colleagues and patients, and this strange feeling of being watched would fade away like morning mist. Then the lights started flashing. Blue and red strobes suddenly illuminated from behind the SUV's grille, cutting through the early morning light with an intensity that made Monica's heart skip a beat. For a moment, she was genuinely confused. She checked her speedometer again. 55 miles per hour, exactly the speed limit. She hadn't changed lanes without signaling. She hadn't run any red lights or stop signs because there weren't any on this stretch of highway. She couldn't think of a single traffic violation she might have committed, but the lights were clearly directed at her, and the SUV was now moving closer, its presence suddenly menacing in a way it hadn't been just seconds before. Monica did what any law-abiding citizen would do. She activated her turn signal, checked her mirrors, and carefully moved toward the shoulder of the highway. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she brought her car to a complete stop. She put the transmission in park, turned off the engine, and rolled down her window. Then she placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they would be clearly visible to whoever was approaching her vehicle. Her heart was pounding, but she reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. This was probably just a random stop, maybe a broken taillight she didn't know about, maybe some kind of checkpoint she hadn't heard about on the news. Whatever it was, it would be cleared up quickly, and she would be on her way. She watched in her side mirror as the SUV pulled up behind her and stopped. 2 figures emerged from the vehicle, and immediately Monica felt her confusion deepen. These men were not wearing the uniforms of State Highway Patrol. They were not wearing the khaki and brown of county sheriff's deputies. Instead, they wore dark civilian clothing beneath tactical vests, and as they approached her car, she could see the large white letters emblazoned across their chests. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Monica's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. ICE. Why would immigration agents be pulling her over? She was a United States citizen. She had never had any issues with immigration because immigration had nothing to do with her. She had been born in this country, raised in this country, educated in this country. She had never even received so much as a parking ticket in her entire life. There had to be some kind of mistake, a case of mistaken identity perhaps, someone who looked like her or drove a similar car or lived in her neighborhood. Whatever the reason, it would be cleared up quickly once she showed them her identification. The first agent reached her window. He was a tall man with a shaved head and a stern expression, probably in his early 40s. His badge identified him as Agent Derek Morrison, though Monica wouldn't learn his name until much later. He did not greet her. He did not ask how she was doing. He did not explain why she had been stopped. Instead, he looked at her through the open window and issued a single command. "Step out of the vehicle now." His voice was flat, authoritative, leaving no room for discussion or questions. Monica felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the morning air. She had never been spoken to like this by anyone in a position of authority. She had never been in a situation where she felt threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect her. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage. "Can you please tell me why I'm being stopped? I'm a nurse. I'm on my way to work at Riverside Community Medical Center. I haven't done anything wrong." She gestured toward the badge on her chest, hoping that the sight of her hospital credentials would somehow humanize her in this agent's eyes, would somehow communicate that she was a working professional, a contributing member of society, a person deserving of basic respect and explanation. Agent Morrison did not look at her badge. He did not acknowledge her question. He simply repeated his command, louder this time, with an edge of impatience that bordered on hostility. "I said step out of the vehicle. Do it now." Monica's hands were trembling as she reached for the door handle. Every instinct in her body was telling her that something was deeply wrong with this situation, that she should ask for a supervisor or demand an explanation or refuse to comply until she understood what was happening. But she had also heard enough stories to know that resisting commands from federal agents, even when those commands seemed unjustified, could lead to consequences far worse than simple humiliation. People had been arrested for less. People had been hurt for less. People had died for less. So she opened her door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of Route 58, her teal scrubs and hospital badge clearly visible in the morning sunlight. The second agent had positioned himself near the back of her car. He was younger than Morrison, perhaps in his late 20s, with a military-style haircut and the rigid posture of someone who took his authority very seriously. He watched Monica with an expression that was impossible to read, his hand resting casually on his utility belt as if prepared for her to make some sudden, threatening move. Monica stood there, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds, wearing hospital scrubs and tennis shoes. And somehow, these two armed federal agents were treating her like she posed some kind of danger. "Sit down," Agent Morrison commanded, gesturing toward the grassy area between the gravel shoulder and the fence that bordered the highway. Monica stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me. Sit down on the ground, right there, now." She looked at the spot he was indicating. The grass was slightly damp with morning dew. It was dirty. There were probably insects crawling through it. And these men wanted her to sit down on it like some kind of criminal, in full view of every car passing by on the highway, in her work uniform that she needed to wear for a 12-hour shift. "Please," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't understand what's happening. Can you at least tell me why I've been stopped? I have my driver's license right here. I can show you my identification. I'm an American citizen. I was born in Tucson. I've lived in Arizona my entire life." She reached toward her purse, which was still hanging from her shoulder, intending to retrieve her wallet and the driver's license inside it. Before her hand even touched the bag, Agent Morrison's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them. Sit down on the ground. I'm not going to ask again." There was a threat implicit in those words, a suggestion that failure to comply immediately would result in something Monica didn't want to experience. She looked around desperately, hoping to see someone who might help her, someone who might witness what was happening and intervene. But the passing cars were just that, passing. Their occupants glanced at the scene and kept driving, either too busy or too frightened or too indifferent to stop. A few slowed down to stare, their faces visible through their windows, but none of them pulled over. None of them offered assistance. Monica was alone on the side of this highway with two federal agents who had given her no explanation, no justification, no reason whatsoever for treating her this way. She lowered herself to the ground. The grass was indeed damp, and she could feel the moisture immediately seeping through the fabric of her scrubs. The morning dew soaked into her pants, leaving dark patches on the teal material. She could feel the rough texture of the earth beneath her, small rocks and twigs pressing into her skin through the thin fabric. She sat there with her legs folded beneath her, her hands visible in her lap, her hospital badge still prominently displayed on her chest. She felt like a criminal. She felt like an animal. She felt like something less than human, all because these two men in tactical vests had decided, for reasons they refused to share, that she needed to be detained. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. This story is one of thousands like it that happen across this country, stories that often go untold because there are no witnesses, no recordings, no evidence to prove what really happened. If you're watching this and you believe these stories need to be heard, I'm asking you to subscribe to this channel right now. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light. It tells the algorithm that this content matters, that people want to hear about injustice and accountability, and the ordinary citizens who find themselves trapped in extraordinary circumstances through no fault of their own. So please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. And now, let's continue with what happened to Monica Turner on that Thursday morning. Monica sat on the damp grass beside Route 58 as the minutes began to crawl by. The sun continued its ascent into the sky, warming the air around her, but doing nothing to warm the cold dread that had settled into her chest. Cars passed on the highway, their occupants catching brief glimpses of the scene before disappearing down the road. Some of them honked, though Monica couldn't tell if it was in support of her or in approval of what the agents were doing. A few drivers shouted things out their windows, words that were lost in the rush of passing air. Monica kept her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, afraid to look up, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might be interpreted as resistance or aggression. Agent Morrison stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with an expression of bored authority. The younger agent had returned to their vehicle and was speaking into a radio, his words inaudible from where Monica sat. Neither of them had asked for her identification. Neither of them had explained what she was suspected of. Neither of them had treated her with even the most basic level of human decency. Monica's mind was racing. What could possibly have led to this situation? She had no criminal record. She had never been arrested, never been detained, never even been questioned by law enforcement for any reason. She paid her taxes. She voted in every election. She volunteered at her church's food pantry twice a month. She was, by every measure that mattered, a model citizen. And yet here she was, sitting on the ground like a suspect in some crime she knew nothing about, while federal agents stood over her as if she were dangerous. She thought about her patients at the hospital. By now, her shift should have started. Her colleagues would be wondering where she was. The children in the pediatric unit would be waking up, looking for the nurse who always had a smile and a kind word for them. The 6-year-old boy recovering from surgery would be asking for her, wanting the smiley face she always drew on his bandages. The teenage girl with the broken leg would be waiting for the encouraging conversation Monica had promised her. Instead of being there for them, Monica was sitting in the dirt on the side of a highway, detained by men who refused to tell her why. She gathered her courage and spoke. "Please, can I at least call my supervisor at the hospital? People are depending on me. My patients need me. I just want to let them know I'm going to be late." Agent Morrison didn't even look at her when he responded. "No phone calls." "But why?" Monica pressed, her voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong. You haven't told me what I'm suspected of. You haven't even looked at my ID. I'm a United States citizen. I have proof. It's right in my purse. Just let me show you." "We're verifying some information," Morrison said, his tone suggesting that this explanation should be more than sufficient. "When we're done, you'll be free to go if everything checks out." "Verifying what information? What is there to verify? I'm a nurse driving to work. That's all. There's nothing to verify." Morrison finally turned to look at her, and the expression on his face made Monica's blood run cold. It was contempt. Pure, undisguised contempt. He looked at her as if she were something beneath him, something that didn't deserve the courtesy of an explanation or the dignity of basic human respect. "Just sit there and be quiet," he said. "The sooner you cooperate, the sooner this will be over." Monica fell silent. There was nothing she could say that would change this situation. These men had already made up their minds about who she was and what she represented. It didn't matter that she was wearing hospital scrubs. It didn't matter that her badge clearly identified her as a registered nurse. It didn't matter that she had been driving the speed limit on her way to save children's lives. They had looked at her and seen something else entirely, something that made them feel justified in pulling her over, ordering her out of her car, and making her sit on the ground like a criminal. And Monica knew, with a sickening certainty that settled into the pit of her stomach, exactly what that something else was. The minutes continued to pass. 5 became 10. 10 became 15. Monica's legs were growing stiff from sitting on the hard ground, and the dampness had soaked completely through her pants, leaving her feeling cold and uncomfortable despite the warming air. Her back ached from the awkward position. Her eyes stung from the effort of holding back tears. She could feel the eyes of passing drivers on her, their curiosity and judgment both, and the humiliation was almost unbearable. She was a professional, she was a caregiver, she was a citizen of this country, and she was being treated like garbage on the side of the road. Then something unexpected happened. A pickup truck that had been approaching from behind began to slow down. Monica watched in her peripheral vision as it pulled onto the shoulder about 60 feet ahead of her car and came to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was white, probably in his mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors for a living. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a plain gray t-shirt. His hair was cut short, and there was a few days' worth of stubble on his face. He looked like exactly the kind of person these ICE agents might expect to agree with what they were doing. In fact, when he started walking toward the scene with a casual, unhurried gait, the agents didn't seem concerned at all. They probably assumed he was just another curious bystander, or perhaps even a supporter who wanted to commend them for their work. That assumption would prove to be their greatest miscalculation of the entire morning. The man's name was Harold Whitfield. He was 44 years old, a contractor who had been driving to a job site on the other side of the city when he came upon the scene unfolding on the shoulder of Route 58. At first, he had done what most drivers did, glanced at the tableau of the two agents standing over the woman on the ground and kept driving. But something made him look in his rearview mirror. Something made him slow down. Something made him pull over and get out of his truck to take a closer look. Maybe it was the way the woman was sitting on the grass, her posture defeated and humiliated. Maybe it was the fact that she was clearly wearing medical scrubs, the uniform of someone who spent their days helping others. Maybe it was the body language of the agents, the contempt and authority radiating from them as they stood over her. Whatever it was, Harold Whitfield felt something stir in his chest that he couldn't ignore. He had seen injustice before. He had stayed silent before. He had told himself it wasn't his business before. But on this particular morning, for reasons he wouldn't fully be able to articulate later, he decided he couldn't just drive away. He walked toward the agents with a demeanor that suggested casual curiosity rather than confrontation. He nodded at them, gave them a look that could be interpreted as solidarity, and said something along the lines of thanking them for their service. The agents, focused on their target and confident in their authority, barely acknowledged him. They certainly didn't tell him to leave. They assumed he was on their side, and they had no reason to think otherwise. Harold positioned himself about 15 feet from where Monica was sitting. He leaned against the fence that bordered the highway, as if he were just settling in to watch the show. And then, with a casualness that belied the importance of what he was doing, he pulled his phone from his pocket and began to record. The camera captured everything from an angle slightly above and to the side of Monica. It showed her sitting on the grass in her teal scrubs, her hospital badge catching the light of the morning sun. It showed the two agents standing over her, their postures aggressive and dismissive. It captured the sounds of the highway, the passing cars, the distant hum of traffic, and it captured the conversation that followed. Every word of it preserved in digital clarity. Monica, unaware that she was being recorded, tried once again to reason with her captors. "Please," she said, her voice audible on Harold's footage. I've been sitting here for almost 20 minutes. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a registered nurse at Riverside Community Medical Center. My patients are waiting for me. Can you at least tell me what this is about?" Agent Morrison's voice came through clearly on the recording. "We already told you. We're verifying some information." "What information? You haven't asked me for any information. You haven't looked at my driver's license. You haven't run my name. You're just making me sit here in the dirt while you do nothing." "Watch your tone," Morrison warned. "Just cooperate, and this will be over soon." "I am cooperating. I've done everything you've asked. I got out of my car. I sat on the ground. I've answered every question you've asked, which is none. What more do you want from me?" The frustration in Monica's voice was palpable, but she never raised it to a shout. She never became aggressive or threatening. She sat there on the ground, her hands visible in her lap, and pleaded with these men to treat her with basic human dignity. The recording captured every moment of her restraint, her civility, her desperate attempts to understand why this was happening to her. I want to pause here and ask you something. What would you have done if you were Harold Whitfield? Would you have stopped to record this scene, knowing that doing so might attract the attention of federal agents? Would you have risked your own safety to document an injustice being committed against a stranger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to know how you would have handled this situation, because Harold's decision to pull over and start recording is about to become the most important moment in this entire story. A few minutes after Harold began recording, a second ICE vehicle arrived on the scene. It pulled up behind Morrison's SUV, and another agent stepped out. This agent was identified later as Kevin Patterson, a newer member of the unit who had been with the agency for about 7 years. He walked over to Morrison, and the two of them spoke briefly, their voices low enough that they weren't captured clearly on Harold's recording. But certain words came through despite their attempts at discretion. Words like description and matches and profile and flagged. Monica heard those words too. Her head snapped up, and she looked directly at the agents as they discussed her fate in terms she could only partially understand. "What description do I match?" she demanded, her voice louder now, cutting through their conversation. "What profile are you talking about? I'm a nurse in scrubs with a hospital badge. What possible profile could I match?" The agent stopped talking and turned to look at her. Morrison's expression hardened. "I told you to be quiet and cooperate. And I'm asking you a simple question. You said I match some kind of description. What description? What am I suspected of? You have to tell me that at least. I have rights." "You'll know what you need to know when we're done verifying things." Monica's voice cracked with emotion. "You're not verifying anything. You're just standing there, making me sit in the dirt while you talk about descriptions and profiles. Look at me. I'm wearing scrubs. I have a hospital badge around my neck. I'm driving to work at a children's hospital. What could I possibly be suspected of?" Agent Patterson, the newer agent, actually looked uncomfortable for a moment. His eyes flickered to Monica's badge, to her scrubs, to her face. But whatever doubt he might have felt was quickly suppressed. He turned away and walked back toward the second vehicle, leaving Morrison alone with Monica once again. Harold kept recording. His phone captured the entire exchange, the agent's evasion, Monica's desperate questions, the fundamental unfairness of a situation where a citizen was being detained without any explanation or justification. He moved slightly closer, pretending to adjust his position against the fence, and the camera angle shifted to capture even more detail. The timestamp on his footage showed that 26 minutes had now passed since Monica was pulled over half an hour of her life, stolen for reasons that no one would tell her. Monica's composure was beginning to crack. She had maintained remarkable poise throughout this ordeal, but the combination of humiliation, confusion, fear, and frustration was taking its toll. When she spoke again, her voice was trembling noticeably. "I've never been in trouble in my life," she said, and the recording captured every wavering syllable. "I've never even gotten a speeding ticket. I pay my taxes. I vote. I volunteer at my church. I take care of sick children for a living. And you're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal, like I'm dangerous, like I'm not even human. I've been sitting on this ground for almost 30 minutes, and you still haven't told me why. You haven't looked at my ID. You haven't checked anything. You're just standing there." Her voice broke completely at the end, and for a moment it seemed like she might start crying. But she pulled herself together with visible effort, taking a deep breath and steadying herself. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her completely fall apart. She would maintain whatever dignity she could, even as they systematically stripped it away from her. Agent Morrison watched her outburst with apparent indifference. When she finished speaking, he simply shook his head slightly, as if disappointed that she couldn't just accept her situation quietly. "If everything checks out," he said, "you'll be on your way soon." "Then check it," Monica shot back. "Here." She reached slowly toward her purse, telegraphing her movements so there could be no claim that she was reaching for a weapon. "My wallet is right here. My driver's license is inside. My name is Monica Turner. I was born in Tucson, Arizona on June 14th. I'm 26 years old. Run my name, check my record, do whatever you need to do. But stop making me sit here in the dirt while you do nothing." For a long moment, Morrison just stared at her. The recording captured his expression, the way he seemed to be weighing his options, calculating how much longer he could draw this out. Then, finally, after 28 minutes of detention, during which he had done absolutely nothing to verify Monica's identity or confirm whether she had any connection to whatever operation he claimed to be conducting, he walked over to her and took the driver's license from her outstretched hand. He looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he walked back to his vehicle. Monica watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Surely now this would be over. Surely the computer system in his car would confirm what she had been telling him all along, that she was exactly who she said she was, that she had no criminal record, no warrants, no immigration issues, no reason whatsoever to be detained. Surely within the next few minutes she would be released with an apology and allowed to continue on to the hospital where her patients were waiting. The verification took less than 4 minutes. Agent Morrison emerged from his vehicle holding Monica's license. He walked back to where she was still sitting on the ground, the damp grass having soaked completely through her scrubs by now. He stood over her for a moment, looking down at her with an expression that contained no remorse, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. "You're free to go," he said, handing her the license. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement that he had just stolen 32 minutes of her life and an immeasurable amount of her dignity for absolutely no reason, just a dismissive statement and the return of her identification. Monica stared up at him, waiting for something more. Surely there had to be something more. He had pulled her over without cause. He had ordered her out of her car without explanation. He had made her sit on the ground like a criminal for over half an hour. He had refused to check her identification until she practically begged him to do so. And now he was just going to tell her she could leave, as if none of this had happened, as if it was perfectly normal and acceptable behavior for federal agents to treat citizens this way. "That's it," she heard herself say. "You detain me for over 30 minutes. You humiliate me in front of everyone passing by. You refuse to tell me why. And now you're just going to say, 'I can go.'" Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance. "You're free to leave, ma'am. I suggest you do so." There was a warning in his voice, a suggestion that pushing this any further would not end well for her. Monica understood the threat implicit in his words. She understood that despite being innocent, despite being violated, despite being completely in the right, she was still at the mercy of these men and the power they wielded. If she pressed the issue, if she demanded an apology or an explanation, there was no telling how they might respond. They could claim she was being uncooperative. They could escalate the situation. They could make her life even more miserable than they already had. So Monica stood up. Her legs were stiff and painful from sitting in the same position for so long. Her scrubs were visibly stained with grass and dampness. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to clench them into fists to keep the shaking from showing. She felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these men. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing how much they had hurt her. She walked back to her car on unsteady legs. She opened the door and sat down in the driver's seat, and for a moment she couldn't remember how to start the engine. Her mind was foggy, her thoughts scattered, her entire body vibrating with the aftermath of trauma and adrenaline. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them once on the floor of the car before finally managing to insert the right one into the ignition. The engine turned over, the familiar hum of her Honda bringing a small measure of comfort in the midst of her distress. She sat there for perhaps 30 seconds, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the highway in front of her. Then she put the car in drive and slowly pulled back onto Route 58, continuing the journey to work that should have taken 18 minutes and had instead taken over 50. She made it to the parking lot of Riverside Community Medical Center. She pulled into her usual spot. She turned off the engine. And then, alone in her car with no one watching, Monica Turner finally allowed herself to fall apart. The tears came in a flood, accompanied by sobs that racked her entire body. She cried for the humiliation she had experienced. She cried for the powerlessness she had felt. She cried for the realization that despite everything she had done right in her life, despite being a good person and a good citizen and a good nurse, she could still be treated like garbage by people who were supposed to protect her. She cried because she understood, with painful clarity, exactly why she had been targeted that morning, and it had nothing to do with anything she had done. When she finally pulled herself together enough to walk into the hospital, she was 48 minutes late for her shift. Her scrubs were visibly soiled. Her eyes were red from crying. Her hands were still shaking. She told her supervisor what had happened, and the woman's face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, outrage, sympathy, and finally a kind of resigned sadness that suggested this was not the first time she had heard a story like this. Monica worked her shift that day. She took care of her patients. She drew a smiley face on the 6-year-old boy's bandage, even though her heart wasn't in it. She encouraged the teenage girl with the broken leg, even though encouragement felt hollow. She comforted the frightened mother who barely spoke English, even though Monica herself felt deeply in need of comfort. She did her job because that's who she was, because sick children needed her, because she refused to let what had happened that morning define the rest of her day, or her career, or her life. But inside, something had changed. Something had been broken, and Monica knew it would never be fully repaired. Meanwhile, back on the shoulder of Route 58, Harold Whitfield had watched the entire scene unfold. He had recorded every minute of Monica's detention, from her initial attempts to reason with the agents to her final humiliating release. When she drove away, he lowered his phone and stood there for a moment, processing what he had just witnessed. Then he got back in his truck, saved the video to multiple locations on his device, and drove to his job site, his mind churning with the implications of what he had captured. Harold Whitfield was not a political activist. He was not a lawyer or a journalist or a civil rights advocate. He was a contractor who built things for a living, a man who had never attended a protest or written a letter to his congressman or involved himself in causes larger than his own daily concerns. But he knew injustice when he saw it. He had watched those agents treat that woman like she was less than human, and he had seen the badge on her chest identifying her as a nurse. And he had heard her plead for basic dignity and explanation, and he had witnessed the complete indifference with which her pleas were received. He knew that without the video on his phone, her story would be nothing more than her word against federal agents. And he knew, from following the news over the years, how those battles usually ended. That evening, Harold did something he had never done before. He reached out to a stranger. Through a series of connections and inquiries, through asking around and following leads, he managed to get a message to Monica Turner. He explained who he was and what he had recorded. He offered to share the footage with her, no conditions attached, because he believed she deserved to have evidence of what had been done to her. Because he believed that what he had witnessed was wrong, and that wrong should be documented, and that truth should have a chance to win. Monica, still reeling from the trauma of the morning, accepted his offer. She met with Harold the following day, and he transferred the video files to her phone. She watched the footage that night, sitting alone in her apartment, seeing herself from an outside perspective for the first time. She saw how she looked sitting on that grass, small and humiliated and powerless. She heard her own voice, trembling but determined, asking questions that were never answered. She saw the contempt on the agents' faces, the casual cruelty of their authority, the complete absence of humanity in their treatment of her. And something shifted inside Monica Turner. The trauma and shame she had been feeling began to transform into something else, something harder, something more useful: anger. Within 10 days of the incident, Monica had contacted a civil rights attorney. The attorney, after reviewing Harold's footage, immediately recognized the significance of what had been captured. This was not just a case of bad behavior by individual agents. This was documented evidence of unconstitutional detention, of violations of the Fourth Amendment, of racial profiling in its clearest and most undeniable form. The video showed a United States citizen being detained for over 30 minutes without any cause being established or even articulated. It showed federal agents refusing to check identification until they were essentially forced to do so. It showed a woman in hospital scrubs with a visible hospital badge being treated like a criminal based on nothing more than her appearance. The lawsuit that followed was comprehensive and damning. It alleged unlawful detention without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. It cited violations of Monica's constitutional rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments. It documented the emotional distress and psychological trauma she had experienced as a result of the incident. And at the center of everything, providing irrefutable proof of each and every allegation, was Harold Whitfield's video. The footage was submitted as evidence within 2 weeks of Monica first contacting her attorney. And within a month after that, the story had exploded into national consciousness. News outlets across the country picked up the story, playing clips from Harold's video alongside interviews with Monica, her attorney, civil rights experts, and community leaders. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. People were outraged by what they saw on their screens. They watched a nurse in scrubs being ordered to sit on the ground like a criminal. They heard her reasonable questions being dismissed with contempt. They saw the arrogance and indifference of agents who clearly believed they were above accountability, and they demanded answers. The federal agency that employed agents Morrison and Patterson tried to defend the stop. Their initial statement claimed that Monica had matched a description circulated as part of an ongoing operation. They suggested that the agents had acted in good faith based on information available to them at the time. They implied that any inconvenience Monica experienced was regrettable but necessary in the interest of public safety and national security. These explanations collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. When pressed for details about the description Monica allegedly matched, the agency's response was vague to the point of meaninglessness. A woman of a certain age range, of a certain ethnicity, driving a certain type of vehicle. This description could have applied to thousands upon thousands of people in the city. It was so broad, so nonspecific, that it essentially amounted to permission to stop anyone who fit a particular racial profile. And that, Monica's attorney argued, was precisely the point. The description wasn't a legitimate investigative tool. It was a pretext for targeting people based on how they looked. If you've been following this story so far, I want to ask you to do something. Type the word accountability in the comments below. I want to see how many of you believe that what happened to Monica deserves real consequences. And while you're at it, if you're finding this story valuable, please make sure you've subscribed to this channel. We're about to get into the part where things actually start to change, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The lawsuit proceeded with remarkable speed by legal standards. The evidence was simply too clear, too damning, too publicly visible to allow for the usual delays and obfuscations that often characterize civil rights litigation. Within 5 months of the incident, the agency had launched a formal internal investigation into the conduct of the agents involved. Within 7 months, decisions had been made and consequences assigned. Agent Derek Morrison, the lead agent at the scene, and the one who had made the decision to detain Monica without checking her identification for over 28 minutes, was terminated from his position. He had been with the agency for nearly 17 years, and in a single morning, he had demonstrated a disregard for constitutional rights and basic human decency that made his continued employment untenable. He had allowed personal biases to override standard procedure. He had detained a United States citizen without any legitimate basis. He had humiliated a healthcare worker on her way to care for children. And he had done all of this while being recorded by a witness he was too arrogant to notice. His termination was upheld on appeal, ending a career that he had apparently convinced himself entitled him to treat people however he saw fit. Agent Kevin Patterson and a third agent who had been involved in the stop, Marcus Wells, were both suspended without pay for 75 days. They were required to complete extensive retraining in constitutional rights, civil liberties, and bias awareness before being allowed to return to field duty. Their personnel records were permanently marked with the incident, a stain that would follow them throughout the remainder of their careers. But the consequences extended beyond individual agents. The footage had exposed a systemic problem, a culture within the agency that allowed stops like Monica's to happen without anyone questioning whether they were appropriate. How many other people had been detained without cause? How many other citizens had been humiliated on the side of the road based on vague descriptions that amounted to nothing more than racial profiling? These questions demanded answers, and the public demanded accountability. The investigation that followed led to significant policy changes within the agency. Body cameras became mandatory for all agents during field operations. New protocols were established requiring agents to verify identification within a set time frame of initiating any stop. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize constitutional rights and the importance of treating all individuals with dignity regardless of their appearance. These changes would not undo what had happened to Monica Turner, but they represented at least a possibility of preventing similar violations in the future. Monica's lawsuit was eventually settled for an amount that was never officially disclosed, but was reported by sources close to the case to be well into six figures. The money was significant, enough to provide some measure of compensation for what she had endured. But far more important to Monica than the financial settlement was the public acknowledgement that accompanied it. As part of the settlement, the agency was required to admit that Monica's detention had been unlawful and that she had been treated in a manner that violated her constitutional rights. This acknowledgement, this official recognition that she had been wronged, meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. In the months following the resolution of her case, Monica struggled with the psychological aftermath of her ordeal. She found herself experiencing anxiety attacks when getting into her car. She became hypervigilant while driving, constantly checking her rearview mirror for vehicles following too closely. She had nightmares about sitting on that grass, powerless and humiliated, while agents stood over her with contempt in their eyes. The trauma of a single morning had carved deep grooves into her psyche, wounds that would take years to fully heal. But Monica refused to let that morning define her. She continued working at Riverside Community Medical Center. She continued caring for sick children with the compassion and skill that had made her excellent at her job long before any of this happened. She sought therapy to help process her trauma, and she found support in her colleagues, her family, and a community that rallied around her once her story became public. Slowly, gradually, she began to rebuild the sense of safety and stability that had been shattered on the shoulder of Route 58. She also began to speak out. Monica had never intended to become a public figure, but circumstances had thrust her into a spotlight she couldn't ignore. She started accepting invitations to speak at community events, at civil rights gatherings, at professional conferences for healthcare workers. She shared her story not for sympathy, but for change. She wanted people to understand that what happened to her could happen to anyone, that rights are only as strong as the will to enforce them, that justice requires vigilance and documentation, and the courage to demand accountability, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Harold Whitfield, the contractor who had stopped to record the incident, became an unlikely hero in the story. He never sought recognition or reward. When reporters asked him why he had decided to pull over and start filming, he simply said that he saw something wrong happening and felt he couldn't just drive away. He knew that without video evidence, Monica's word would have been pitted against federal agents, and he knew how those battles typically ended. The camera on his phone had been the great equalizer, transforming a one-sided power dynamic into a documented truth that could not be denied or explained away. The video Harold recorded has since been viewed millions of times online. It has been used in training programs for law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of what not to do. It has been cited in legal briefs, academic papers, and policy discussions about racial profiling, civil rights, and police accountability. It has become a reference point in the ongoing national conversation about how power is wielded and who is subjected to its abuses. Looking back at the incident on Route 58, several critical failures stand out. First, the agents never checked Monica's identification at the beginning of the stop. This is a basic step in any legitimate law enforcement encounter, yet they completely skipped it. Second, they detained her for over 30 minutes without any legal justification, refusing to even articulate what she was suspected of. Third, they denied her request to make a phone call or to stand up instead of sitting on the ground. Fourth, their entire basis for stopping her was a description so vague that it could have applied to a significant portion of the city's population. And fifth, if Harold Whitfield had not been there with his phone, none of this would have been provable. That last point is perhaps the most important takeaway from this entire story. Monica could have filed a complaint about her treatment. She could have told her story to anyone who would listen, but without video evidence, it would have been her account against the official narrative of federal agents. History has shown us time and again how those disputes typically resolve. The person with institutional power and authority almost always wins, while the individual citizen is dismissed as exaggerating, misremembering, or lying outright. The video changed that dynamic entirely. It transformed an invisible injustice into an undeniable fact. It gave Monica proof that could not be argued away. The implications of this case extend far beyond a single nurse and a single traffic stop. It highlighted how easily authority can be abused when there is no mechanism for accountability. It demonstrated how racial bias, even when never explicitly stated, can drive decisions that destroy lives and dignity. It showed the critical importance of witnesses who are willing to document wrongdoing instead of simply looking away. And it proved that even when institutions attempt to protect their own, enough public pressure combined with irrefutable evidence can force real change. The system that allowed Monica's detention still exists. The broader issues of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and selective enforcement remain pervasive problems throughout American law enforcement. The agents who were suspended eventually completed their retraining and returned to duty. The culture that produced this incident did not disappear overnight, and vigilance will be required to prevent similar violations in the future. But this is also a story where accountability was achieved, where evidence mattered, where one person's decision to stop and record made the difference between a wrong that was buried and a truth that was exposed. Monica Turner did not choose to become a symbol. She simply wanted to drive to work and take care of sick children. But on that Thursday morning in late March, she was forced into a situation that revealed deep flaws in systems that are supposed to protect everyone equally. Her courage in pursuing justice, combined with Harold Whitfield's decision to document what he witnessed, created a moment of accountability that rippled far beyond a single roadside detention. The agents involved learned that actions have consequences. The agency learned that policies must be followed and that bias cannot be tolerated. The public was reminded once again that these incidents are not isolated anomalies, but symptoms of larger problems that require constant attention and reform. Monica continues to work as a nurse. She continues to save lives. She continues to drive to work every day, though the memory of that morning will likely never fully disappear. But she also continues to speak out, to share her story, to remind people that justice is not automatically granted. It must be demanded. It must be documented. It must be fought for by ordinary people who refuse to accept that some citizens deserve less dignity than others. So what can we learn from what happened to Monica Turner? Perhaps the most important lesson is this. In a world where injustice often hides in plain sight, where power can be abused without witnesses, where an individual's word is easily dismissed against institutional authority, sometimes all it takes is one person with a phone and the courage to use it. Harold Whitfield could have driven past that scene. He could have told himself it was none of his business. He could have assumed the agents knew what they were doing. He could have stayed silent, like so many others before him. But he didn't. And because he didn't, a wrong was documented. Justice was served. A nurse who had done nothing wrong was able to prove it, and a system that needed to change was forced to confront its own failures. This is not a story with a perfect ending. Monica still carries the trauma of that morning with her. The agents who were suspended eventually returned to work. The deeper problems that enabled this incident to occur remain unresolved in many ways, but it is a story where truth won, where evidence mattered, where the courage of ordinary people made accountability possible. And sometimes, in a world that often feels overwhelmed by injustice, where the powerful seem to operate without constraint and the vulnerable seem to have no recourse, that has to be enough. It has to be enough to keep witnessing, to keep recording, to keep demanding better, because the next Monica Turner could be anyone. It could be someone in your family. It could be someone in your community. It could be you. And when that moment comes, when injustice unfolds before your eyes, the choice Harold Whitfield made will be the same choice available to you. Drive past and say nothing, or stop, pull out your phone, and make sure the truth has a fighting chance. If this story has meant something to you, I want to ask one final thing. Please share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, not because I want views, but because stories like Monica's need to reach as many people as possible. They need to be part of the conversation we have as a society about power, about accountability, about who gets treated with dignity and who gets treated like something less than human. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please consider doing so now. We bring you true stories that matter, stories that expose injustice and celebrate the ordinary people who stand up against it. Your subscription helps ensure that these stories continue to be told. Monica Turner went back to work the day after her life was turned upside down. She drew a smiley face on a sick child's bandage. She held the hand of a frightened mother. She did her job with compassion and professionalism, even as she was still processing the trauma of what had been done to her. That is who she is. That is who she chose to be, even when the world gave her every reason to be bitter, to give up, to believe that nothing she did could make a difference. Harold Whitfield went back to his construction site with a video on his phone that would change everything. He didn't know what would happen next. He just knew that he had seen something wrong and decided not to look away. That simple decision, that moment of moral courage, made all the difference. We live in a time when cameras are everywhere, when moments of injustice can be captured and shared and amplified in ways that were impossible just a generation ago. This technology gives us power that previous generations could only dream of, the power to document truth, to hold the powerful accountable, to ensure that stories like Monica's cannot be simply dismissed or denied. But technology is only as valuable as the people willing to use it. The camera on Harold's phone meant nothing until he made the decision to turn it on. The video he recorded meant nothing until Monica had the courage to pursue justice. The evidence they created together meant nothing until a community responded with outrage and demanded accountability. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people decide that injustice is not acceptable, when they refuse to look away, when they use the tools available to them to ensure that truth has a chance to prevail. It is a reminder that change is possible, that accountability is achievable, that the powerful are not beyond the reach of consequences, and it is a call to each of us to consider what we would do if we found ourselves in Harold Whitfield's position. If we saw something wrong happening, would we stop? Would we record? Would we have the courage to stand as witnesses, even when it might be easier to just keep driving? The answer to that question matters. It matters for the next Monica Turner, whoever and wherever she may be. It matters for a society struggling to live up to its ideals of equal justice and equal dignity for all. It matters for the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of people we want to be. Monica Turner sat on the grass beside Route 58 for 32 minutes on a Thursday morning. She was humiliated and frightened and completely without power, but she was not alone. Someone was watching, someone was recording, and because of that, she was able to prove what happened to her and demand the justice she deserved. May we all have the courage to be that someone when the moment calls for it.